Chapter 1. On the evening of August 8th, as Billy Hudson sped into the sheriff's office in his cherry-red Firebird, the prized Cadillac driven by Sheriff Andrew Lutz was narrowly avoided being sideswiped. Sheriff Lutz looked up from the old magazine he was mindlessly flipping through at the sound of tires screaming. In a single smooth move, he left his desk and crossed half of the station as he watched Billy's Pontiac's fender approach the driver's side door of his caddy. Looking at his scratched metal watch, Lutz wondered what the heck Billy was thinking. Lutz immediately assumed that the young man had been drinking because it was just a few minutes into the morning on a Saturday. What sort of intoxicated driver drives himself voluntarily into police custody? Billy Hudson stumbled out of the driver's side door, fell to his knees, and then stumbled back to his feet before the Firebird's wheels had come to a complete stop. "They are no more!" As he scrambled for equilibrium, Billy cried out of breath, "I believe all of the Maguires are dead!" Lutz's lips was already open to reprimand Billy for almost slamming the door of his Cadillac, but as Billy said those words, his jaws clicked shut. Lutz observed the situation in front of him. After Sheriff Bradley retired in 1975, he served as Richmond County Sheriff for more than 10 years, winning re-election twice. He spent most of his time on the highways in the 40,000-person county, which is 400 square miles in size, and was familiar with Billy Hudson and his gang of gearheads. Billy was a courteous child who always showed respect, but that wasn't always the case with the town's youth. The adolescent males in the area were completely enamored with their automobiles, and they were frequently seen late at night drinking, drag racing, and having a wild time on one lonely rural road or another. They weren't particularly horrible kids. There just wasn't much else to do in a place where maize and soybean fields predominated. Once they became too unruly and started blaring the speakers on their stereos loud enough to wake the long-suffering farmers in the neighborhood, Lutz or one of his deputies would have to go out and disperse the gathering, which would happen at least once a month. Lutz believed he understood what may have occurred, his heart sinking. "Which of you struck them? What location was the accident?" "Sheriff, no one hit them." Billy firmly shook his head as he went for the walkie-talkie at his hip. "Tonight we weren't racing. The fact that Stu Lennox damaged his father's brand new Ford and—" "Get right to the point, Billy," Lutz expanded. Saying, "Sorry, sir," Billy had to take a deep breath before continuing since he had started speaking so rapidly that his words were tripping over one another as they rushed to come out. "Sheriff, there was no racing tonight. Molly Green, who resides in Oakville, and I were out. I drove her home after we had gone to the drive-in. I chose to travel the former Highway 99 on the way back because I wanted to. I enjoy how quiet it is outside at night. More accurately, the Pontiac was revved up away from the troopers on the state route with the intention of upsetting the calm." Sheriff Lutz was silent as he thought. "Anyway, I went at the Maguire property, you know that large wooded area next to the farm? As I was traveling there, I believed I saw something cross the street, similar to a large shadowy bear. Frightened the hell out of me. I almost lost control of the vehicle. Son, there are no bears in this area." "Sure it wasn't a deer?" the sheriff said skeptically. "Sir, it wasn't any darn deer. It moved like a cat but had a bear's hump and slope. It was the first deer I had ever seen, but I only saw it for a split second. Its height was more than my car's roof. What kind of crap was that?" Lutz glanced down while running a hand over his thinned-out black hair. At that point, he observed that Billy's dirty work boots and the hems of his pants were covered in blood. Lutz took a hesitant step backward, moving his right hand ever so slightly toward the handgun holstered at his hip. He started inspecting the red Pontiac for dings and scratches, thinking the animal narrative was nothing more than a ruse. He cautiously circled back to the young man after searching for none, keeping a 10-foot distance. "All right, Billy, before we start to run into trouble, you have approximately 12 seconds to start making sense. Why do you claim that the Maguires are no longer alive? Whose blood, kid, is that on your shoes?" "Sheriff," I was attempting to explain. "As I was traveling along the old Highway 99, I noticed a large, menacing creature crossing the street. I'm not sure, sir, I'll be really honest, but it frightened me so much that I was on the verge of falling. Whatever it was had vanished into that area of forest close to the Maguire plot when I finally managed to stop the car on the shoulder and turn back. I came to the same conclusion as you, sir. Thought I was just seeing things late at night," Billy continued. "But then I noticed some sort of liquid on the road in my headlights, like oil, but when I took another look, it wasn't oil." "Blood was seen?" the sheriff questioned, Is it possible this animal or whatever you saw could have been wounded? The moment I got out of the car and reached into the trunk for my Winchester gun, I said, "That's the first thing I thought too, Sheriff." I reasoned that I could at least end the suffering of the poor creature. But as I went closer to the blood on the road, when I got closer, Billy began to stammer, and it appeared as though all the strength in his legs had failed. His oil-stained blue pants slipped into the plush grass of the station's yard as he almost elegantly knelt down. "Go for it, son." "How did you see that?" Lutz queried. While he was making an effort to be patient, it was essential that they get at the site of any crime as quickly as possible. Billy inhaled deeply while trembling. "An arm, please." A woman's arm was on the side of the road, barely past my headlamp. The elbow was severed. It still wore a wedding band. It was still wearing. At this point, Billy was trembling so violently that the sheriff feared he could be about to experience a seizure. He took a minute to glance around, perplexed by the sudden turn of events that had previously been his tranquil evening. He then crouched down close to the young man who was shaking on his haunches. Lutz habitually inhaled the air around Billy Hudson's head, almost hoping to catch a fragrance of booze like whiskey or gin. However, nothing was there. Lutz made a U-turn and headed back toward the sheriff's office. He shouted Clarkson for his senior deputy. Soon after, Henry Clarkson emerged from his cramped office and asked, "Sheriff?" Thank glad Clarkson was in charge tonight. Clarkson was a cool-headed cop who performed well under pressure. Henry Clarkson, the sole African-American on the police, had a commanding voice and a barrel chest that he could use to great effect on rowdy suspects. However, he also had a rational mind that ran over every scenario in his head before acting. Lutz prayed again, this time in relief that it wasn't Miller, his younger, jitterier deputy who was sharing the station tonight. "Is the cruiser full of gas? Good. Get the shotgun and the rifle, and also some flashlights. Highway 99 is our destination because something could have happened at Bud McGuire's house. The fact that Clarkson obeyed directions without questioning him endlessly was an added bonus." Following a brief nod, the deputy turned to carry out the request. Back outside, Lutz knelt down next to Billy Hudson, who was still hunched down on the grass with his head in his hands. Lutz yearned for a smoke because his tongue tasted bitter. "Billy, it's all right. Son, nice work. It's all right." Andrew Lutz repeated the mantra, "Just breathe," again and over, recalling how his father had used a similar approach to calm tense horses. The stiff strain along Billy Hudson's back softened, and after a few minutes his breathing started to calm. Billy inhaled slowly for a further 1 or 2 breaths before turning to face the sheriff. He added with deadly determination, "After I found the arm, I proceeded into the home. Sir, I can't describe it. However, something terrible occurred there. If it's acceptable, I'd want to go right now and go home." Billy Hudson deserved to be told by Sheriff Lutz that he could return home, take a nice shower, and have a stiff drink. But it was not to be. "Billy, I'm sorry. Please point out the precise location of where all of this occurred. We'll drive right by it in the dark as there are no lights there." Billy's face appeared to be fighting back tears for a moment, but his mouth clenched, and all he could muster was a helpless nod. While the 2 senior men went to check on the McGuires, Lutz contacted his junior deputy at home, waking him from a sound sleep and ordering him to drag his ass over and man the station. The 3 of them then boarded the sheriff's vehicle and drove toward Highway 99 in the north. Chapter 2. The little town's mostly darkened structures gave way to the entirely darkened farmland that made up 90% of the region as the 20 miles from the sheriff's department to the McGuire farm passed in nearly utter stillness. Every little village in the county was surrounded by endless acres of maize and soybeans, with a distance of up to 40 miles between each settlement. Since Lutz had lived his whole life in Richmond County, that region will always represent the horizon for him. Rarely did splotchy clumps of trees and thorny bushes break up this endless expanse of farmed land. Except for the Iowa River Nature Preserve, which covered approximately 30 miles of property on the western side of the roadway, the majority of these forests were little more than 20 acres broad. Bud McGuire's farm was located on the eastern side of the street. Andrew Lutz had always felt uneasy in those woods. It was a strange, quiet location with skeleton pines and briar bushes that didn't have any of the hidden paths or bubbling streams that he had loved as a child in the wooded areas. Hunters didn't utilize it either. Even in an area overrun with ravenous deer, they had no inclination to chew on the brittle pine bark that the trees gave. It was unclear what kind of nature the state administration intended to preserve. It was impossible to see anything beyond the orange beam of the cruiser's headlights with the smallest sliver of the waxing moon shining in the sky. Every man was deep in meditation. As they departed the station, Sheriff Lutz explained the situation in general terms to his deputy. At least one victim. Probably more. Reports of an enormous beast. A mountain lion, perhaps. The question, "A mountain lion, sir?" When Andrew informed Officer Clarkson, he was completely perplexed and questioned. "Sheriff, have you checked around? Do you notice any mountains?" "If we're going to Bud McGuire's house, sir, you and I both know what we're going to discover there." "Yes." Lutz pondered as he backed onto Highway 99's cracked pavement. "I am quite certain of what we will discover." His hands were begging for a smoke, but he resisted the desire. He attempted to ignore the sinking sense of dread in his gut as his thoughts turned to Bud McGuire. When Andrew Lutz first met Buddy McGuire, he was in his mid-20s. He had observed a small child sitting in the dirt next to a dog in an abandoned lot while on patrol one afternoon, traveling through the town's peaceful streets. On its side, the dog was sleeping. Lutz parked and went over to the couple, worried that a cherished pet had been hit by a car. The child observed the brindle mutt convulse in the dust while shallowly panting. It had large, mournful eyes. Buddy, who at the time could not have been more than 8 or 9 years old, watched the dying animal without displaying any emotion. The question, "Is this your dog, son?" Lutz had politely inquired. Buddy remained silent. Buddy ignored Lutz and continued to observe the dog as its breathing slowed, even though most youngsters were always courteous to police officers, at least in those days. "What happened to this animal, do you know?" Lutz retried it, yet nothing. At the boy's feet, though, Lutz had later seen a sheet of butcher paper balled up. He could also make out pieces of ground flesh when he looked closer. In his mind, a picture of what had happened was starting to take shape. "Boy, did you feed this dog poisoned bait?" Lutz demanded for the first time using a louder voice. When Lutz yelled, the youngster finally turned to look Lutz in the eyes. The officer took a step back in shock at the child's expressionless face. Being addressed by a stranger, a policeman at that, there was neither dread nor any inclination of intimidation. Buddy McGuire's eyes didn't reflect anything back. Lutz, who was shaken, had told then-Sheriff Bradley about the event. Bradley made the observation that the animal had been a stray, not a beloved pet, by hooking his thumbs into the drooping waistband of his pants. Although it was a horrific death, local farmers would frequently shoot or poison stray animals that trespassed into their land. On rare occasions, the mutts would murder chicks and ducks, or even start posing a threat to the farmers' young children as they played outside. The youngster had presumably learnt it from seeing his own father, who was a necessary evil. Later that evening, Lutz had returned to the vacant property and had interred the animal by hand. Buddy McGuire established himself as one of those boys who are just incredibly good at hurting others over the course of the following 10 years. When Buddy was in the 6th grade, a senior had made fun of him for having untidy, messy hair. Buddy had approached the bigger child in full front of the classmates and teachers, grabbed his wrist and twisted until bones crunched.